Hi, everyone. Today I'm talking to Dr. Jeffrey Bale, a professor of mine who I haven't seen in 28 years from my senior year in college. He's professor emeritus at the Middlebury Institute, and he's a world authority on extremist groups and political violence. So I hope you guys enjoy. Okay, Jeff, thanks so much for joining. You were my professor in 1997 at a small liberal arts college in Portland, Oregon. Like, do you remember me, or did you remember me when I reached out to you, or no? It's okay if you don't, but
Yeah, I vaguely remembered you, and when you reached out to me, I had a vague recollection of you, but uh, that's about it. It was a long time ago, you know.
yeah. How do you I don't think you realize like the impact that you had on my education, because most of the other subject matter I worked on at that time, I don't, you know, in retrospect, I don't find to be like super impactful. But your class, it was like the last semester of my senior year, really made an impression on me in terms of like really understanding the First Amendment and freedom. I remember you did a lecture on like the Skokie, Illinois case that
Mhm.
really crystallized what free speech is. But how do you remember that time? Like, I was thinking today, when I got there, I found it strange personally to refer to professors by their first name, like to talk to someone who was older and kind of like credentialed and in, a position of import.
Yeah.
Did you find it strange, like at that time? What was your impression of it?
Well, no, for me, it's never been strange because I've always been a very informal person, and I don't really like too much pomp and circumstance, and so I don't feel as though students should be necessarily have to be deferent. I mean, if somebody wants to call me professor, that's fine, but if they want to call me by my first name, that's okay as well. So I'm perfectly okay with just having like informal interactions and relationships with students. You know.
Yeah. And did
And
you
so
find, sorry, go
yeah.
ahead.
No, again, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, did you find it, I found that college to be kind of strange. It was sort of like the beginning, for me at least, of like woke ideology. I remember one of the courses I had, the professor would allow students to grade themselves. And we were able to like talk about the coursework itself if there was too much reading, and like use up all of the time, not really learn anything except about human nature.
Right.
And most of the coursework that I had was like cultural anthropology,
Hmm.
what people would now
That's
refer to
that's
as
not
like
a that's a bad
very,
that's a field that's really taken over by ideologues,
yeah.
cultural
So
anthropology. Hmm.
um, is that like, was that the beginning of something, or do you feel like academia has been basically the same for like the last 30 years?
No, no, this is already beginning a long process of decline, in my opinion. Um, I should first point out that I first went to university in the early 70s after spending a few years having a lot of fun, in the sex, drugs, and rock and roll countercultural lifestyle. Finally, I went back and because I was getting bored, and I went back and uh, so I got my I finished my undergraduate education in like the 70s, and then I went on to graduate school, and then I dropped out again for several years because the punk thing began, and so I was having a lot more fun. If there's countercultural rock and roll fun to be had, that's gonna be my priority. And so that's basically so I my whole education was my at the college level was delayed because of my own lifestyle choices, and I didn't really get my PhD until the mid 90s at Berkeley. But by that time, there'd been a dramatic transformation of the university. Uh, I mean, when I first started going, there was a much more rigorous. There were much more. There were most of the professors were, I would say, serious scholars. And then into the 1980s, more and more people were hired on the basis of their political views and their ideological worldviews, and uh, that happened to coincide with the decline of standards in many ways in terms of course requirements and grade inflation and all that kind of thing. And then, of course, there was the big surge of political correctness in the 1980s, where dogmatic students and dogmatic professors were trying to impose their views on everybody else, and in the classroom and outside the classroom. And being a person who's always been like a very critical, independent thinker, and who doesn't like any kind of authoritarianism on the one hand, and doesn't like any sort of anybody trying to impose some rigorous doctrines on my thinking. All this stuff I found appalling, and most of it, in fact, virtually all of it, was coming from the left. I mean, maybe if I'd been going to Bob Jones University, there would have been, people imposing like religious dogmas from the right, and trying to control your behavior and your thinking. But at the places I was, which is the University of Michigan, and then Berkeley, and then at Columbia, at those places, pretty much all of the pressure for ideological conformity and all the fashionable, faddish academic trends were associated with the left, postmodernism, and all the detritus of that crap. And so basically, there was just less and less people who were serious scholars, less and less people who were trying to be objective in terms of when they were studying something, they were trying to gather information and then evaluate it carefully instead of going into it with preconceived theories and so forth and so on. There were less and less people who felt that there was that trying to be objective was a valuable thing. And instead, we're basically arguing that since nobody could be completely objective, we should just be as subjective as we want to be, and we can wear our politics on our sleeve, and then use our classroom as a bully pulpit, and throw out all pretense of trying to be fair, balanced, and objective. And unfortunately, a lot of faculty members and students adopted those kinds of attitudes, and so when we're talking about the problems that beset contemporary universities, the woke imbecility, I mean, that's basically just political correctness in a slightly different iteration. It's really nothing new. I mean, there was already in the 1980s, the left was already embracing toxic identity politics, and so everything that we now associate with wokeness, fanaticism, intolerance of dissent, promoting, viewing people as representatives of groups, denouncing people as heretics who don't share your belief system. All that stuff really began in the 1980s and was called political correctness, and then it continued on into the 90s and really never disappeared. It kind of went in waves, but then in the 2000s, especially after 2010, it resurged with a vengeance. And the problem is, I mean, it'd be bad enough if wokeness and political correctness and that kind of fanatical dogmatism and moral self-righteousness, it would be bad enough if that was confined just to the universities. But unfortunately, all the people who graduate from the universities who've been indoctrinated with this, then they go out into the real world, and now those attitudes have permeated the entire society. So people in government have those attitudes. People in the media have those attitudes. People in NGOs have those attitudes. People in the corporate world have those attitudes. People throughout the educational system have those attitudes. So we really reached a point of saturation in the of the entire society being corrupted by crackpot ideas from academia.
How do you think that it became corporatized? And I think in the 90s, like when I kind of came up, people would engage with this stuff and then they'd kind of put it to the side when they left school and started a career, and it would just people sort of grew up, so to speak.
Yeah.
But it's establishment. What do you think?
It is a total establishment. I mean, the thing is, people are careerists. Most people are cowards and careerists. So most people in any kind of social context are going to go along to get along. That's the first thing. And if they're going to accept whatever the fashionable orthodoxies are to further their career, and because most of them are not independent thinkers, and then when they graduate, they're going to adapt themselves to whatever environment they're trying to get a job in. So if they're trying to get a job in a corporate world, they're going to adopt whatever behavior patterns, dress codes, and attitudes allow them to succeed. At that time, though, the corporate world had not been totally corrupted by these kinds of ideas, by this woke lunacy, um, and so people still, when they graduated from the rarefied environment of the university, they had to, when they went into the real world, they had to kind of jettison a lot of the bullshit, or at least on the surface, and in order to adapt and conform to the new environment that they were in. And so that's basically what most of them did. The problem is in the last 25 years, those horrible ideas from academia have now permeated even the corporate world. And so now people who are brainwashed and indoctrinated throughout the entire educational system, beginning in K through 12, through high school and into the university, then they end up going into the corporate environment where those ideas are also now regnant. And so they don't really have to change their ideas. They don't have to adapt and adopt more realistic perspectives, because they get rewarded for peddling for public virtue signaling of those kinds of ideas. Their support for feminism and for racial equity and social justice and all that kind of stuff, which is, of course, all those doctrines have become completely radical. I mean, every iteration of feminism has become more and more radical and deranged. Struggles for equality before the law have turned into demands for quotas, for race and gender quotas. So basically, all these ideas have just become increasingly destructive and harmful, and they've become increasingly institutionalized. And therefore, it's almost impossible for a person to escape these noxious ideas in any sphere of life. And of course, if people are trying to get a good paying job, if they go into any kind of environment, whether it be government or the private sector, where those kinds of ideas are at least publicly expressed or supported, then they're going to just mouth those platitudes and abandon any kind of critical thinking. And so it's like in most eras of history, the overall majority of people are conformist. They're social conformists. They defer to authority, and that's just unfortunately a common feature of the human condition that we just can't seem to escape. I mean, the joke is always that despite all the technological progress we've made over the millennia, we're still basically animals with a thin veneer of rationality, with all of the negative and positive emotions that make us who we are. And so people are still, the majority of people are going to go along to get along. They're going to publicly express ideas which are considered acceptable, and they're going to defer to authority and essentially conform. I mean, that's just a sad, grim reality. And that's why you see that, whenever like witch hunts are initiated, why so many people just immediately jump on the bandwagon and join the witch hunters and are happy to persecute the heretics and the so-called witches. I mean, we saw that during COVID, where the majority of people mindlessly accepted the official narrative about COVID, almost every single claim of which was a lie. I mean, we could go back. I mean, I'm not a medical expert, but I mean, we now know that most of the claims made by the public health officials like Fauci were false. They claimed that the virus came from the wet market, when in fact the overall majority of people and intelligence agencies now believe, as I suspected from the middle of June 2020, having studied biological warfare, came from was leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and then we learned, of course, that Fauci had funded this dangerous gain of function research at that lab, and they were in the Chinese lab was not using biosafety 4 protocols, but biosafety 2 level protocols, which were not sufficient, and so basically they killed millions of people. Then they lied and claimed that the vaccines, that the mRNA vaccines were actually vaccines, which meant that they actually prevented you from getting a disease. A vaccine is something that prevents you from getting a disease. And then, of course, it didn't prevent you from getting the disease. It may have mitigated the symptoms, especially for older people, but it didn't prevent you from getting the disease. And then they redefined vaccines so that it applied to the mRNA vaccines. And then they claimed that if you got the vaccine, not only wouldn't you get COVID, but then you wouldn't be able to spread it. That was a bald-faced lie. And then we now know from emails and from investigations that Fauci and all those public health officials were desperate to try to suppress anybody who was challenging the narratives that they were pushing, which did a tremendous amount of damage, led to lots of deaths. There was immense economic damage to the country and to the entire world. And they were desperately trying to suppress any kind of dissident thinkers by calling them conspiracy theorists and crackpots, and the usual way that the establishment tries to delegitimize people who challenge it. And so it's just, but you saw, I mean, how so many regular people were caught up with this. The people who accepted like the official narrative were blaming everybody who wasn't accepting the official narrative, and blaming people who weren't vaccinated for everything bad that was happening. And, basically suggesting that a lot of people were saying, well, just let them die, let these people die. They shouldn't even be allowed to be treated if they have something else, because, they're anti-science fanatics who are spreading this thing. And otherwise, if everybody got vaccinated, it wouldn't spread. All that was a lie. But millions of people believed it all over the world. And that was the line that the elites were pushing and peddling. And so you see right before our eyes, the kind of things that those of us who study extremism and have known for all along, that it doesn't take much to create a social panic and to whip up a frenzy and to demonize people and turn innocent people into heretics, and then to justify persecuting them. I mean, that's just the world we live in. It's not even in democratic societies, even in democratic societies like the United States, where we are, we're inculcated to some degree with an individualistic ethos, and we take our personal freedom seriously, and we're jealous of our personal freedom. We don't like restrictions on our personal freedom, and yet we see even in that kind of an individualist society, which I basically support, an individualistic society. Even in that kind of individualistic society, you see how quick people are to mobilize into a crowd, as it were, and to persecute, hunt down, to vilify, to hunt down, and to persecute people that they think are threatening them.
Yeah, I found it during COVID. I mean, I thought this was just common knowledge among everyone, like the idea of, first of all, free speech and having open debate. There was no debate. And then seeing the tyranny, I live in California, experiencing firsthand tyranny.
Oh, it was terrible in California.
Of being locked down and then having elected officials like out to dinner with no mask on, going on about their business and locking everybody down without a word about civil liberties.
Yes, that's
right. And I just thought, holy shit, like why isn't everyone up in arms about this?
Well, because of fear, because the elites and the media were peddling fear. They were peddling nonstop fear about millions of people dying. You could be next. These people were potentially endangering your life and all this kind of stuff. And so it worked. It worked. But like you say, of course, the elites behave differently than they're trying to impose restrictions on everybody else, but they don't even follow the restrictions they impose on others. In the same way that all these people who are promoting eco-apocalypticism and climate catastrophism and demanding that regular people, drive less or use electric cars, they're flying around in private jets to conferences, virtue signaling and posturing all the time, using up far more fossil fuels than any regular citizen. And so the whole thing is just like a joke. I mean, I don't see how anybody can take the elites that currently run Western society seriously, because they're just foolish, they're incompetent, they're hypocrites, and they're increasingly authoritarian. And that's the worst part of it all, actually. The idea that you can only have authoritarianism in like a society that isn't formally democratic, well, that's just complete nonsense. you know, you can have societies that, I mean, the Soviet Union has an electoral system. People vote in elections. It doesn't mean that the Soviet Union's democratic. So, and all kinds of regimes call themselves democratic, like the North Korean regime. I mean, everybody likes to call themselves democratic, but the proof is in the pudding. How are you behaving? That's what determines whether you're democratic and anti-authoritarian, or whether you're an authoritarian who is happy to engage in tyranny or support tyranny as long as you're benefiting from it. And unfortunately, the elites that we have in Western countries nowadays are that's exactly their characteristic. I mean, they're always talking about defending democracy and blah 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 blah. We have to ban this party, and we have to arrest this person, and we have to do this and that, and we have to arrest people for social media statements that we don't like, and but we're defending democracy, and I mean, it's just absolutely an outrage. They're persecuting their political opponents in democratic societies. That's what's going on.
Why do you think, Jeff? Why do you think, like, one of the things that I realized back in, I think it was 2017 or 18, it was like the spying on Trump. I wasn't a Trump supporter at the time, but I watched a documentary on the spying on Trump, and I thought, my first reaction was like, holy shit, this is a subversion of democracy.
Absolutely.
Whether I support Trump or not, I
Correct.
believe in democracy and freedom.
Correct.
So therefore, I thought nonpartisan, anyone who was aware of this would come out against it publicly and say, like, I'm not, it's not a left or right issue.
That's exactly right.
What do you think has happened? Like, what has happened from, I thought there was a collective understanding of freedom of speech and democracy in America, that there was like a red line, but there isn't, like, and young people don't understand the First Amendment.
No, they clearly do not understand the First Amendment, and they don't understand most of the Bill of Rights, to be honest with you, if truth be told. The problem we have is, and let me just tell you, I've spent decades studying covert operations, covert political and paramilitary operations. And political and religious extremism. Those are my areas of expertise. And when all this stuff began, like in the in 20 when Trump was first running for office there, and there was all these people like all of a sudden peddling this nonsense about collusion with Russia and all this kind of stuff, and they were engaged in surveillance, and turned out later that we know that they were engaged in sting operations overseas with the help of foreign intelligence agencies. I mean, the whole thing is just. But as soon as I read the Steele dossier, one of those media sources published the Steele dossier, like I think it was in December, and basically, as soon as I read that, I laughed out loud. I said, "This is complete crap." I said, literally, no serious person could read this and believe anything that's in there. And the fact that the FBI and the DOJ and people within the CIA, what's his name, Clapper and Brennan, were basically using this fraudulent document that was paid for by Hillary Clinton's campaign. Hillary Clinton's campaign, through a couple of intermediaries, a law firm and another firm, hired this former British intelligence operative to write this scurrilous report, and then they passed it around to people in U.S. government agencies, and those people in the government agencies who we now know were extremely hostile to Trump, and this is of course because Obama did one of his most lasting and horrible legacies was was politicizing and weaponizing government agencies and pointing all kinds of radicals and partisan operatives in government agencies in his efforts to fundamentally transform America, quote unquote. And basically, you had all these people who were essentially rabid Democrat partisans who were in all these government agencies who were using bogus opposition research funded by the Clinton campaign to justify running illegal covert operations against a presidential candidate, and then after he was elected against this a sitting president. That's really what we had, and all that nonsense was hyped by the media, the mainstream media, basically just the mouthpiece of the establishment. I mean, the American media is a total joke. Anybody who takes the New York Times and the Washington Post seriously, I mean, I like to sell them a bridge between Marin County and San Francisco. I mean, how gullible and stupid do you have to be to actually take these things as serious media sources? So the point is, we're living in an environment where the media was hyping all this hysterical nonsense pushed by one political party and by the establishment to demonize and delegitimize the opposition candidate, and then later the president, and then they use that to justify this ridiculous Mueller investigation. All of the people involved in that were Trump-hating activist lawyers. Mueller was already senile as basically a figurehead. And the whole thing was just an absolute disgrace. They wasted $30 million of taxpayer money trying to find evidence of Trump-Russia collusion, which, of course, they could never find. And so, because there wasn't any Trump-Russia collusion. So the whole thing is just like, I mean, it really is the biggest scandal in my lifetime in terms of American political history. It's much more of a scandal than Watergate. I mean, vastly, much more of a scandal than Watergate. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, then after the 2020 election, which was certainly corrupted and compromised by the Democrats in various ways, changing electoral laws in violation of state constitutions, and I don't even want to go into it all. The point is, after Biden won, and I don't know whether he won or didn't win. I mean, the election was compromised, and nobody was willing to actually do any serious investigations. But the point is that when Biden took office, then the same malicious lawfare that these people in the establishment were waging against Trump when he was president were renewed in an even more extreme way. All of these lawsuits against Trump. I mean, first of all, the persecution of the J6 protesters, and let me be clear about this. I mean, as far as the J6, it was a large, mostly peaceful protest of people who were rightly upset because they felt that the election had been corrupted. But there were like a few hundred knuckleheads, two or 300 knuckleheads and extremists who use that peaceful protest as a cover to launch like violent actions and to create a riot. This is the same thing that happens with many left-wing protests, where you've got like a large peaceful group of people, and then you've got like a small cadre of Antifa and sectarian Marxists who use the cover of a larger protest as a way in which to initiate violence and create disruption and riots. And that's exactly what happened.
The FBI was involved, Jeff?
Pardon me?
Do you think the FBI was involved on January 6th? There's a lot of bomber and.
Let me just say this. I mean, one of the things that I've studied is actually the covert manipulation of extremist groups and terrorist groups by factions of the Secret Service. I wrote my PhD dissertation in Berkeley about the strategy of tension, which was a situation in Italy and other European countries, Spain and Portugal and Latin American countries, where factions of the Secret Service were covertly supporting neo-fascist and other radical right-wing paramilitary groups and encouraging them to carry out campaigns of violence and terrorism, and then protecting them after they carried those things out. This is a very well documented thing. I went through tens of thousands of pages of Italian judicial materials and parliamentary investigative reports. It's very well documented. There's no doubt that this happened. So I'm very familiar with the techniques and the mechanisms that Secret Services use to manipulate extremist groups. Now, as far as January 6th, I mean, I just don't think we have enough information to know. We know that there were FBI informants in all the groups. We know that there was FBI informants in the Proud Boys. We know there's FBI informants in the Oath Keepers. So we know that the FBI had confidential informants in all of those organizations, including some high-ranking people in those organizations. Now, the question is, we know that there was other informants and probably agents in the crowd. We just don't know what exactly they were doing. Were they just monitoring the situation and gathering intelligence, which would have been perfectly legitimate activity, or were they engaged? Were they acting as agents provocateurs? Were they trying to provoke violence and trying to instigate violence and instigate a conflict? And I mean, I suspect that some of the latter was going on. I mean, certainly the behavior of the Metro DC police, they were firing sting balls and other non-lethal weaponry into a peaceful crowd in front of the Capitol before any of the disruption began. So I mean, they were making people angry. They were deliberately attacking people and making people angry. Now, maybe it was just because they were fearful and they were getting hysterical, or maybe it's because it was part of a plan to provoke something. I don't know. I just don't think we know the answers to that question. But one thing we do know is that the arrests of all these people who were peaceful protesters on January 6th, people who didn't commit any acts of vandalism or violence, but who had the book thrown at them, accused basically of all kinds of imaginary crimes, interrupting an official procedure, and all these kinds of crimes that had never been applied in those situations before. I mean, they were the DOJ and the FBI and activist judges were persecuting those peaceful J6 protesters. I mean, there's no way about it. They were giving them stiff sentences. They were putting them in that DC gulag and in terrible conditions. I mean, contrast that with the treatment of the violent protesters in 2020 during the summer of Floyd. I mean, all these people they did $2 billion worth of damage, for fuck's sake. 30 people were killed. They destroyed all kinds of small businesses, mainly in Black communities. I mean, these protesters, the BLM protesters and the Antifas and all these people.
Do you think that was part of a state action?
I don't know that it's a state action. I think it's a different kind of a thing, because then you're sort of suggesting that I think you're ascribing too much planning and frankly, coherence and efficiency and omniscience to the security forces and to the government agencies. What I think is it's a much different situation. First of all, the media was cheering all this stuff on. The media was generating hysteria about the Floyd death. They were cheering all these protests on. The Democrat politicians were openly supporting them. And then when they became violent, they lied. The media was lying and gaslighting, pretending that a lot of them were peaceful and there wasn't violence, when of course, in fact, a certain percentage of them were violent and extremely violent, some of them. And then when people were arrested who were involved in that violence, Kamala Harris and some other Democrat politicians were basically trying to raise bail to get them out of prison. I mean, so you have one political party in America which was actively cheering on violent disruptive protests based on a false narrative pushed by Black Lives Matter. And then even when people were arrested, they weren't prosecuted. They were slapped on the wrist. Nobody suffered any serious jail time. Some of these protesters were even given settlements, for God's sakes, because the police had to. I mean, that's just that tells you right there that there's a two-tiered justice system. That people who were much more violent, left-wing protesters who were much more violent, or Black militant protesters who were much more violent, got slaps on the wrist and even got settlements from some of these cities run by progressives, quote unquote. Whereas the J6 people, even people who were involved in no violence, were getting the book thrown at them. If you don't think there's a two-tier justice system there, I mean, I don't know what else you would call it. I mean, it's so blatant. And now, of course, we see the same thing all over Europe too. Same thing in Britain, the same thing in most European countries. All the same stuff is going on now with that.
Yeah,
so,
you can be arrested in the UK. People
for posting a mean tweet. You know. Meanwhile, if you're a jihadist who murders somebody, you might get an 18-month sentence. You know, I mean, it's just unbelievable.
What do you think is behind, Jeff? What do you think is behind, like, I think a lot about, the collapse of Western civilization, the World Economic Forum, that there's this kind of global movement that is either consciously or unconsciously through mass immigration, progressivism, and then authoritarian, authoritarian implementation is
Mhm.
destroying the West. Do you think
Oh,
this is
well,
like,
I agree with that.
is it
I agree.
coordinated, or is it just like like, how do you
Well,
view it as
I
an,
think we really have to be, once again, I think we have to be careful here because there's a tendency of people, this is what conspiracy theorists do.
right, just to
They
simplify?
ascribe far too much power, competence,
Yeah.
omnipotence to small groups of elites than they actually have in the real world. Most of the thing we have to understand is that most of the people who form our ruling elites are not particularly competent. They're ideologically deluded. They're caught up in these bureaucratic kind of these bureaucracies that are inefficient, wasteful, and everybody who's ever worked in a government agency knows how many incompetent people there are working in those agencies, and knows there's a lot of deadwood there that don't do any work and are just collecting paychecks at a sinecure. So bureaucracies, contrary to Max Weber's claim that bureaucracies would be more efficient and rational. Well, we see that in the real world, bureaucracies not nearly as efficient and rational as the proponents like to claim. So I think that there's a very real danger of ascribing too much forethought and plotting and planning to what's going on. No, I see it as a different, and this is where I think people who make these kinds of claims open themselves up to legitimate charges that they're promoting conspiracy theories. I think the real issue is actually simpler, but actually maybe even more worrisome. I mean, if it were only a case where there was like small cabals of people who were secretly running everything and foisting these policies on everybody to destroy the West, I mean, that would be, of course, bad. But what I really think is it's something much less solvable. I mean, if there was a small cabal of people who were involved in this kind of machinations, you could identify them and get rid of them. That's really not the problem we have now. The problem we have, in my opinion, is that the elites running Western societies all are globalists. They're all globalists, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. But let me just, before I get to that point, let me just make the case that the key fundamental gulf, the key political gulf in contemporary world is not between the left and the right. It's between globalists on the one side, globalists left and right on the one hand, and anti-globalists left and right on the other. And I think that's where we have to understand where the main political fault lines are now. And therefore, if people are looking at things with this absurd conventional left-right spectrum, this archaic and oversimplified left-right spectrum, which most people do view the world through, I think they're missing basically what's really going on. So when I'm talking about globalist elites, what am I talking about? I'm talking about people who share the same values, people running Western societies who share the same values. What are those values? These are people who see themselves as citizens of the world rather than citizens of their own country. And they have more in common with other people who feel like they're citizens of the world than they have with citizens in their own country. That's the problem. They're an elite class that has values, that embraces ideas and values that are radically different than the values of their own citizens. And that's why they're constantly working at cross purposes against the interests of their own citizens. And let me just give you an example. I mean, so for example, people like to pretend like they're global citizens, but it's a worthless abstraction. It doesn't really mean a damn thing. Because if you're in a foreign country and you run into some kind of trouble, the first thing you're going to do is go to the embassy of your nation to get help. You're not going to go, hey, I'm a citizen of the world. Hey, I mean, it's just like completely absurd nonsense. But the
Yeah.
point is, these people feel like they're more enlightened than their fellow citizens. They have, they've adopted these progressive, quote unquote, values. And whenever I say progressive, I'm always using quotes because, in my opinion, progressivism is actually a fundamentally regressive ideology. But that's a whole nother point. I mean, to me, progressivism is fundamentally at odds with genuine liberalism, and I'm a genuine liberal. I'm an old-fashioned liberal. To me, progressivism is actually illiberal. And we can get into that at some point if you want. But anyway, the point is you've got these progressive globalist elites who think that they're smarter than everybody else. Why? Because they're credentialed. because they operate within rarefied social milieus and rarefied social circles with wealthy, powerful people like themselves. And they basically live in a bubble. They live in the same kind of a bubble that the professoriate, the people in academia operate within. It's divorced from the real world. They don't understand the effects of the decisions they make on people in the real world. And so they're just pushing utopian, nonsensical, naive ideas. Like, for example, we can all just get along. We can have a borderless world and we can all just get along, like a Benetton commercial, or something ridiculous, totally ignoring the vast gulf between cultures in the world, between civilizations, cultures, and their values, between tribal societies and Western societies, which had seemed like had transcended tribalism, totally ignoring different historical traditions. This naive fantasy that we can all just get along if we do. That's a completely absurd idea that millennia of history have demonstrated over and over again is false.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like all these utopian ideas, like by definition, when you say something's utopian, it means it's unrealistic and unachievable. So people trying to create a borderless world where everybody from all the different groups can mingle and get along. And, it's just utterly absurd when you've got cultures throughout the world that have values that are completely antithetical to one another.
Is this are you kind of referring to third worldism?
Well, third worldism is like kind of a left-wing version of like romanticizing like the third world against like the first world, romanticizing the oppressed against the so-called first world oppressors.
The noble savage.
Yeah, the noble savage, the totally ridiculous romanticization of primitive and backwards societies. That's very common, as you know, in cultural anthropology. This absurd claim that, before agriculture and before states were formed, primitive societies were peace-loving and peaceful. That's complete nonsense. There's evidence all over the world, archaeological evidence all over the world of widespread warfare and cannibalism in pre-modern societies. I mean, the idea that they were living in some kind of Eden, like stupid Rousseau thought.
Yes.
That I mean, it's just like this absurd romanticization of the other, but the people who romanticize the other are mainly doing it to criticize the self, mainly doing it to criticize their own societies. That's why people tend to romanticize and glorify other cultures when they're trying to criticize their own culture, the flaws of their own culture. I mean, give you a perfect example: Tacitus, the Roman historian who wrote the Germania, who romanticized the Germanic tribesmen. And he contrasted the bravery and the nobility and of the Germanic and the egalitarianism of the Germanic tribesmen with the corruption and the hierarchy and the of Roman society, the decadence of Roman society. So this tendency of Western intellectuals to romanticize the other goes back to antiquity. There's nothing new about it, and if anything, it's even more entrenched now. So we kind of got off on a tangent. What were we talking about right before?
I was actually curious. You mentioned right-wing globalists. You were kind of drawing the distinction between left and right, but actually globalist to
yeah.
national.
Like for example, you could say that most corporate globalists would be, unless they become totally woke, would be right-wing globalists in the sense they'd be capitalists that are promoting free trade and happily transferring American manufacturing jobs overseas to make a profit. Mm-hmm. So those are people I would say would be globalists on the right. Now a lot of them have at least adopted like a facade of like wokeness, but they're basically just people trying to make money, and they don't care. They don't really care how many of their fellow citizens they harm by promoting these kinds of policies, like promoting free market fundamentalism and things like that, right? So those are people I call globalists on the right, as opposed to the progressive globalists. But they both are promoting a kind of borderless world. They're both promoting this idea that that we shouldn't be primarily concerned with the interests of the citizens of our own country. And then that raises the question, well, you can understand economic elites feeling that way, but why would political elites, especially ones who were elected in Western countries, have the idea that their main responsibility isn't promoting the interests of and protecting their own citizens, the people who elected them? I mean, that's the fundamental most fundamental job of government. When a government
It's
is elected,
incredible. It's
when a government,
incredible that it's even controversial now
that's right. It's
to
incredible that it's even
dissent,
controversial. Yeah,
like to dissent for paying for like illegal immigrants,
correct.
healthcare, et cetera.
Exactly.
But like the American citizen should bear the burden of that.
That's
And for
exactly right.
international
Yeah,
conflicts,
that's a
if
perfect
that's
example.
even remotely controversial, is like it's like bizarre to me.
It's totally bizarre, but that's the whole point where we have these elites that are so deranged because they've totally forgotten that their most important job is promoting the interests and defending the interests of their own constituents, of the fellow citizens who elected them, not to prioritize the interests of foreign nationals at the expense of their own citizens. I mean, it's just utterly insane. It's a complete inversion of what the proper function of government is. And that's one of the key aspects of this whole globalist agenda is obliterating the distinction between citizens and non-citizens, making it seem as though non-citizens have the same rights as citizens have. Why is that the case? Why is that the case? No other country in the world outside the West has that attitude. Literally no society, no country, no culture outside of the West thinks it's a better idea to prioritize the interests of foreigners over the interests of their own group. Who would think that? It's only in this insane modern West where people are afflicted with this tremendous sense of guilt about supposed, mostly imagined, but also real past crimes that were true.
Where do you think the guilt comes from?
Well, on one level, I don't necessarily even think of it as like. I mean, in some ways, it's guilt. I mean, because what these people do is these globalist elites, they spend most of the time trashing their own societies, vilifying the traditions in their own countries, undermining the institutions of their own country, their own cultures, and that's what their policies are designed to do. Is they're designed to break down national sovereignty, to erode national sovereignty. They're designed to break down national cohesion. By importing huge numbers of people from radically different cultures who don't share the same values, and leading to social divisions, to social chaos, to cultural conflicts, and frankly, is leading increasingly to violence. And it's only going to get worse, though. The more people you import from the world, by the way, the world's most regressive, dysfunctional, and backwards cultures. Why would any sane person think that importing millions of people from all these corrupt, dysfunctional, backwards cultures into the West without vetting them, and then providing them with massive social benefits, who would think that was a good idea if they didn't essentially hate their own civilization and their own nation?
Right. And we've been battered so much that to voice that opinion publicly, at least in the circles that I was, I run in,
Yes.
that's like, right, you're going to pay social consequences for holding that completely rational and normal opinion.
Well, that's right, because that opinion is so rational and normal that 90% of the human group, outside the West, virtually every human group believes that.
Yes.
I mean, so what's truly radical is the idea that you should prioritize the interests of foreigners at the expense of your own group. That's like
Yes.
that
That's
is like
enlightenment.
not only radical, but it's suicidal. It's as God Sod would say, it's like suicidal empathy. Suicidal
Exactly.
empathy. You're so concerned about the poor and dispossessed somewhere else. Meanwhile, you don't mind if there's hundreds of homeless people littering your own streets and you're not doing anything to institutionalize them and to get drug addicts treatment or to get mentally ill people treatment. You're allowing this shit to go on in your own country, but you're opening your arms for the whole world, all the dysfunctional dregs of every other civilization to come to the West. I mean, it's just almost unbelievable. Now, let me just make it perfectly clear. I mean, it's good to attract the best and brightest. I mean, one of the things that the West has always done is attract the best and brightest people from other cultures and other civilizations, and that's one of the strengths of the West. We get smart people from all over the world who then add and make great contributions to the West. That's a good thing, you know. And so uh, appealing to trying to attract the best and brightest people from other civilizations and cultures and bringing them into the West through legal processes, a legal immigration process, that's a good thing. That's a positive thing.
Yeah.
But how is it beneficial to let vast numbers of unskilled, oftentimes subliterate people from tribal societies with values that are antithetical to Western values, letting millions of these people into your own country and thinking that somehow there's magic dirt in Western countries that's going to miraculously transform these people into productive Western citizens? I mean, it's just, I mean, could there be a belief that's more naive than that? I can't imagine. I mean, the only people who could believe that are literally people who know nothing about history.
Yeah. Is there, do you think, are you hopeful at all with Trump coming in, or do you think there's a way to turn this around in the education system?
I'm not hopeful for many reasons. I mean, certainly, I think that Trump is maybe the last chance we have in America to reverse these destructive processes. Unfortunately, I just don't know that he is up to the job. I mean, I feel like he's got too many character flaws and personality flaws, and he's on many issues he has good instincts, but in terms of actually getting things done, I mean, on one level, he portrays himself as a pragmatist who's a deal maker, but like just an example, I mean, how he's gone off the rails here, the Iran situation. Now he thinks he can negotiate a deal with the Iranians. You can't negotiate a deal with the Iranians any more than you can negotiate a deal with the North Koreans to have them get rid of their nuclear program. Clinton tried that in the 90s. It totally backfired. Obama and Biden were rewarding the Iranians, bribing them basically to delay developing their nuclear program. It didn't work. And now here's Trump saying we can make a deal allowing the Iranians to have a civilian nuclear. Once you have a civilian nuclear program, you can militarize it. End of story. You can't allow the Iranians to have to develop the capacity to make nuclear weapons. An apocalyptic millenarian Islamist regime. You can't allow those people to. So this is an example where Trump somehow naively thinks he can do a deal with people who've violated every single.
Do you think in this case that's because of there's a lot of isolationists on the right now, like
Yes,
Tucker Carlson, that are in his ear that I think legitimately have been, everyone got burnt with the Iraq War.
Correct.
I don't think George W. Bush Jr. gets enough. There isn't like enough, punishment for what he has done to American foreign policy and standing.
But the problem is that Bush is just the problem is the American foreign policy, bipartisan American foreign policy has been a disaster for decades. Because it's based on these naive views that we can spread democracy by force if necessary. We can nation build, we can recreate everybody. It's based on a fundamental hubristic idea that everybody wants to be like Americans.
Which is neoconservatism, right?
Which is utterly absurd. I mean, talk about naive.
So
the idea is that we can, if we apply soft and hard power, we can spread it. We can turn everybody into an American. But
what I wanted to get at is with Tucker Carlson and some of these other isolationists on the right, there's this movement or this idea that the U.S. can just completely withdraw from the world.
That's absurd.
I don't know. I mean, the Iranians didn't do anything to me. Are they an enemy of the United States?
They are, because
if they get an intercontinental ballistic missile with a nuclear warhead, we're fucked.
Yeah.
It's in our interest.
Well, then they're in a position to blackmail us. The point is they're in a position to blackmail us.
And
even if they don't use them, right?
So how do you correct that? I understand on the one hand, foreign entanglements that are unnecessary, like the Iraq War. But then also making people understand that the world, we live in a global society. Basically, the world is a chessboard and a fight over resources. We have global trade, so we have to have some kind of forceful presence in the world.
Yeah, well, more importantly, the world is a dangerous place. The world is a dangerous place, and we have many bitter enemies throughout the world. The Islamists are our bitter enemies. The Chinese communists are our bitter enemies. That's just the reality of it. And we can't sugarcoat that. We can't pretend like they're not. And that's the whole problem with this opening to China and opening the trade with China. People were making this another naive assumption that people in the West have that, oh, if we can just free the markets, if they have free markets, it'll it'll undermine their totalitarian political institutions, and then there'll be more free in other words, democratizing the market will somehow democratize the political system. Where has that happened? I mean, it's democratize inculcating democratic values is something that takes generations to do. It's not something you can wave a magic wand or snap your fingers and transform people's values. I mean, it's just absolutely preposterous. So, yeah, we have dangerous enemies and we have to deal with them. And the Islamists are our dangerous enemies. We have to target Islamists. We have to kill jihadists wherever they are with drone strikes or special operations. Anybody who's plotting large-scale terrorist attacks against Western countries, or even against our allies in Muslim countries, we need to help them deal with those people. I mean, modern Muslim
to Israel, the conflict in Israel.
absolutely. The Israelis have to eradicate jihadist cadres in Hamas. I mean, that's what the Arab governments did. That's what secular regimes in Iraq and Syria did. That's what the Egyptian government did. I mean, that's what the Libyans under Gaddafi did. Anytime Islamists started creating trouble, the iron fist would just come down on them. That's what the Jordanians have done. That's in other words, regimes in the Muslim world understand the nature of Islamism, and they're perfectly willing to use extreme repression to deal with them because they know if these people overthrow the existing regimes, they're going to create a totalitarian theocratic state. It would be worse than any regime that exists in the Muslim world, a totalitarian theocratic state, which is why Iran's worse than the Saudi Arabia now, and why Syria might end up being worse than it was under Assad, because now we've got this jihadist lunatic who's the leader of Syria. I mean, and Trump's cozying up to him too. I mean, that makes no sense. Okay, I mean, of course, Biden would have too, but the point being is that this is just delusional thinking. So, in other words, the other thing is these isolationists. I mean, people like Tucker Carlson have kind of gone off the deep end. I mean, they've become so critical of the American establishment that they're actually functioning almost as apologists for Putin. Which is going way too far in the other direction. Or arguing like you were suggesting, well, the Iranians aren't so bad, blah, 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 or can't we make deals with China? Well, yeah, we can make certain kind of deals with China, but in other areas, we have to recognize we have irreconcilable interests, right? I mean, that's the same thing that we have to understand with Iran. It's not in the interest of anybody, anywhere, except the Iranian regime, to allow the Iranian regime to develop the capacity to produce nuclear weapons. And to me, this is a perfect example of where we need an airstrike to try to destroy the Iranian nuclear program. And there's the point. You were talking about interventions. There's different kinds of foreign interventions, and most of them have been stupid. Most of our foreign interventions, like in Iraq, was a fiasco. In Afghanistan, after the initial phase, where we were relying on the Northern Alliance and providing help to let them defeat the Taliban, most of our foreign policies since that initial phase in the war on terrorism have been an absolute disaster. And because they've involved invading foreign countries and putting boots on the ground and trying to transform other backwards cultures, that doesn't work. We're not good at nation building. We're not going to spread democracy in a country like Afghanistan, where most of the people have medieval values, frankly. That's just not going to happen. So this is just kind of naive, stupid foreign policy, the kind that the neocons and liberal internationalists promote. What we need is very aggressive but very selective and targeted military strikes against bad actors that don't involve putting American troops on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no reason why we can't use air assets to destroy between Israel and the United States to use air assets to destroy the Iranian nuclear program. That should be something that should be obvious. That doesn't involve doesn't necessarily involve regime change in Iran. It doesn't involve invading Iran. It doesn't involve anything. I mean, hopefully, if the Iranian regime is so discredited that maybe the Iranian people will rise up and overthrow them. I mean, that would be I wouldn't have too much faith in that, because the Iranian regime has a pretty sophisticated repressive apparatus. But nevertheless, one way that totalitarian and authoritarian regimes collapse is when they suffer military defeats. Like look at the Argentine military junta collapsed after the British defeated them in the Falklands War. That's a fairly common thing. Anyway, so the point I'm trying to make is there's a middle ground here between like total disengagement with the world, like some of these naive people like Tucker Carlson are pushing, or even maybe Tulsi. I don't know what she's actually pushing, but some of the things she said seem a little bit naive. There's a middle ground between that and like the idiot war hawks like Lindsey Graham and all these kind of people who are constantly pushing for military invasion and for spending more money, like in Ukraine and all this kind of stuff. And there's another disaster. I mean, the Ukraine war should never have happened. It happened mainly because the NATO expanded. The U.S. and Western countries kept expanding NATO to the frontiers of Russia. The Russians said all along that this was not going to be. This was a red line, that Ukraine could not be allowed to join NATO. And the U.S. and other countries had promised Gorbachev that we weren't going to expand a Western and anti-Russian military alliance to the Russian frontier if the Soviet Union collapsed and everything. And yet we did. So we violated all those agreements. We intervened in Ukraine and Maidan with disastrous consequences, because that led to the Russian invasion of Crimea. Again, I'm not absolving the Russians of their responsibility for the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, Putin's a thug, an authoritarian thug. He's an ultra-nationalist. He's a person who has, he's like what you would expect from a former KGB operative, right? And there's no justification for carrying out some of the kinds of actions that the Russians are taking in Ukraine. But Ukraine has been behaving in the same stupid fashion, and Zelensky's been made a complete fool. I mean, when Trump came in just recently, he gave them both an off ramp. They both had an off ramp. They could have ended this goddamn thing. Nobody would have been totally happy, because the Ukrainians were not going to recapture all their territory, and Russia wasn't going to be able to get everything they wanted. But both parties would have basically, it would have been a deal that was based on the military stalemate that's existing now, that the Russians are in a slightly improved situation. If the war continues, the Russians are probably going to gain territory, and Ukraine is going to lose more. So you think that Zelensky, if he had the slightest bit of common sense, he would have gone, yeah, let's get this done. Let's do an off ramp. Let's not make ridiculous demands like we demand that the Russians return Crimea. That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? So I don't know what the hell. Zelensky thought he was going to achieve by making those kind of demands, and now both sides have escalated militarily, and so now we're in a mess where the war is heated up instead of cooling down. So that whole thing has gone to hell in a handbasket, and now we've got the mess with the Iran. So anyway, I mean, getting back to the point you were making, I don't know if it's still. I'm very pessimistic about the future of the West, because I don't think that nationalist and populist movements, which are resisting globalist elites and globalization trends, are going to be able to seize the reins of all the institutions in Western society. All the institutions in Western society, now there's progressive hegemony in them. And I don't really know. And meanwhile, the educational system is totally controlled by progressivism. So as long as new generations of people are being indoctrinated with these crackpot ideas, and as long as these people are in charge of all the institutions in Western society, including the media and government agencies and international organizations and all this kind of stuff, World Economic Forum. I mean, I don't see how, uh, uh, even if national populists win elections, even if they're able to form governments, because what usually happens if they win elections, the other parties form a cordon sanitaire and prevent them from actually forming a coalition and they keep them out of power. They ban their political parties, all these authoritarian measures that they're using now. So I just don't think. And then there's the question of the competence. I mean, who knows whether these national populist leaders, even if they're able to mobilize popular support, whether they have the ability to actually achieve the goals that they're trying to achieve. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, look at Maloney. I mean, she won the election. You know, you would have thought that the very least that would have happened would there have been a significant decrease in the levels of immigration, but it really just didn't happen. You know, so I don't know. I mean, obviously you've got a out of control judiciary in every Western country now, which is trying to block every executive branch decision that they don't approve of. I mean, the judiciary is completely exceeding its authority, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
There's a judicial tyranny effectively now, and that's the other problem. It's like the left controls the judiciary. So I just don't see how we can return to a sober center. I mean, that's really what I want. I mean, you know, I'm not a conservative in any way, shape, or form. I'm not socially conservative or culturally conservative. I mean, I'm a countercultural rebel, for God's sakes. I'm pretty much anything goes. I mean, you know, let your freak flag fly, you know. So
That's so Jeff, can we end on this? I wanted to ask you about punk, like, is anything punk now in
oh yeah,
2025? I
see,
don't mean the genre of music. I mean, like, is
yeah,
any
punk. Anybody who's got a critical, cynical, oppositional, rebellious attitude has a punk attitude. I mean, that's just the reality of it. Now, of course, it's better when it's associated with an entire countercultural milieu with great music, and it still is. I mean, there's great punk bands all over the world. You know, there's a spirit of rebellion. As long as there's alienated teenagers, as long as there's alienated rebellious teenagers, there's going to be primitive rock and roll, primitive anti-establishment rock and roll, giving its finger to the authorities and the mainstream of society, and that's just always going to happen. The problem with punk, though, is that it got corrupted by all these factionalized political components. Um, you know, and it was formerly like a big tent movement where all the alienated rebellious people who were opposed to the status quo could come together. But then all these internal factions began to emerge because people were pushing radical political ideas and trying to impose their political ideas on everybody else in the scene. So you had like the kind of left wing punk movement, like the Maximum Rock and Roll was embodied, and I was unfortunately part of that problem for a while until I realized that the whole attempt to politicize these countercultures always leads to disaster. It led to disaster in the 60s. It's led to disaster with the punk scene. Then you had like the radical feminist, the riot girl thing. You had the straight edge thing, the moral Puritan. We're not drinking. We're not doing drugs. Blah, 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 blah. You know, you had the macho hardcore, like the kind of stupid thing. You know, you had like Krishna punk and Christian punk and, you know, every kind of idiotic variety of punk you could possibly imagine, all of which you would have thought had been completely antithetical to the real spirit of punk. You know, all those factions emerged within the punk scene, and then basically it just divided it up into niche segments. You know, and so there are still the rebellious, radical individualist, anti-establishment punks like me who are out there, but and there are bands that reflect those values. But then there's the bands that reflect all the other things, the anarcho punk thing, the riot girl, the straight edge, the, you know, whatever you want to call it. And then of course there's in reaction against the left wing drift, then you had the rise of like the neo-Nazi elements on the neo skinhead movement. So you basically have just created like this mess, this attempt to politicize the scene. And this was done by external parties like the Socialist Workers' Party tried to politicize the punk scene in Britain. The Revolutionary Communist Party tried to do it in the United States. And that gave this idea to the National Front and the British movement. Well, we got to do the same thing with elements of the skinhead movement. We can try to mobilize them in support of our thing. And so you ended up having this ridiculous polarization and degradation of subcultures and countercultures that are now fighting amongst themselves and at loggerheads with each other. And so they're not all together in one big tent fighting against the system anymore. So
is there a MAGA punk?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, because to me, the MAGA is just kind of like, I don't even know what that means. I mean, are there punks who support Trump? Sure. Are those people like people who are like part of the Trump cult? Of course not. Are they people who are like QAnon conspiracy nuts? No, but there are people who support Trump by default because the political establishment is so horrible in this country. Both parties, well, what I call the bipartisan uniparty, has promoted such destructive and damaging policies for decades now that have done so much damage to the American working and middle classes that I would support anybody who would challenge those parties that wasn't promoting worse things.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean I have any illusions about anything. I mean, I would like to see like a person who's a moderate nationalist and something of a populist in the sense that he's concerned with the majority of people, form a movement that pushes against the bipartisan elites and does something and tries to benefit the American people.
Maybe it'll be born out of this feud with Elon and Trump. I don't know.
I hope so. I mean, this ridiculous feud. I mean, talk about stupid, man. I mean, it's one thing to have a disagreement about the budget, and on this, I'm more or less in agreement with Musk. But it's another thing to then start making personal attacks and causing it to degenerate into like the stupid pissing contest and everything like that. And that's what you have when you have two egomaniacs like Musk and Trump, and both of whom are somewhat narcissistic. I mean, it can degenerate into this kind of stupidity that's totally counterproductive. And that's, I think, what we're seeing right at the moment. I don't know.
Think, Jeff, sort of last question just to wrap up, but
yeah,
something I'm concerned about is tech authoritarianism with the rise of AI. And some of these people that Trump and MAGA have kind of brought into the tent. Like,
I don't actually think so. I think
about it or no?
I think well, it's not that I'm not concerned. I'm concerned about anything that people are doing, anything that people in power are doing, because there's always going to be people in power who are abusing their power. So I'm always concerned about that. But I think the main threat comes from managerial elites rather than technocratic elites. The managerial elites, like this gigantic bloated bureaucracy we have in DC, the gigantic bloated bureaucracies we have in every Western country, the gigantic bloated bureaucracy with the UN and the EU. To me, that's where the main threat to freedom comes from. These unaccountable, distant bureaucracies run by people with globalist agenda who are promoting policies which are doing an enormous amount of harm to the people in every Western country. That's where the main threat. And as those elites increasingly lose the legitimacy, as they are now, as they increasingly lose the legitimacy, they tend to become increasingly authoritarian. And as they become more authoritarian, they're going to lose more legitimacy. And so we're in this downward cycle where the ruling elites are in a spiral of decline, and they could collapse at some point. But then the question is, what's going to replace them? And I don't know the answer to that. With respect to the dangers of technological, I don't know if it's technological managerialism that I'm worried about. I'm more worried about the pernicious effects of technologies themselves. I mean, I don't know what the effect of AI is going to be. I mean, there's a lot of doomsayers and then there's a lot of utopians with respect to evaluating AI. And I mean, just from the standpoint of a former faculty member, I think AI has already had a tremendously damaging effect because students are now going to be writing papers with AI and doing even less work than they're already doing. And we already have a problem where most students have don't have adequate skills. They don't have adequate reading skills. They don't have adequate writing skills. They don't have adequate math skills. They've been coddled by getting inflated grades throughout their entire educational career. And so you've got a lot of people now in college and even in graduate school, except at the very top levels, very top universities. You've got a lot of people in colleges and graduate school who are really who don't even belong in universities. They'd be better off going to vocational schools, quite honestly. And now we've got technologies that enable them to write papers. And now the burden is going to be on professors to try to identify when people are not even writing their own papers, that they've just used AI programs to write their own papers. I mean, it's just going to degrade the whole process even more and allow lazy people without adequate skills to try to pass themselves off as having more knowledge and abilities than they actually have.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Jeff, I think we have to end there, but
Okay.
thank you so much for joining.
You're welcome. And I just the last point I'll make is that I tend to be a pessimist rather than an optimist. And so I always see the glass being half empty. So I mean, generally speaking, I consider that the realistic attitude, because usually the pessimistic attitude ends up being the realistic attitude. But I hope I'm wrong. I hope that all these negative things that are afflicting Western countries, which I think are leading to the collapse of Western civilization. I mean, I always joke that I feel like I'm a Roman citizen in the year 450, like 26 years before the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. That's the way I feel. I think the West is on the verge of precipitous collapse. I hope I'm wrong, and I'd love to be wrong, but unfortunately, that's my fear.
Wow.
So on that happy note.